In the early morning darkness of September 1st, 1983, a Boeing 747 carrying 269 passengers and crew disappeared from radar screens over the Sea of Japan. Korean Airlines Flight 007 had been shot down by a Soviet fighter jet, killing everyone on board. The tragedy would become one of the most controversial incidents of the Cold War, raising questions about navigation errors, military protocols, and the hair-trigger tensions that brought the world dangerously close to nuclear confrontation. To understand how this disaster unfolded, we must return to that night when a routine flight from New York to Seoul became a catastrophic case of mistaken identity, poor communication, and Cold War paranoia. Korean Airlines Flight 007 began as an ordinary passenger flight. It departed from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York on August 31, 1983, bound for Seoul, South Korea, with a scheduled refueling stop in Anchorage, Alaska. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, one of the safest and most reliable passenger planes in service. At the controls was Captain Chun Byung-in, an experienced pilot with nearly 11,000 hours of flying time. His crew included First Officer Son Dong-hui and Flight Engineer Kim Yui-dong. The passenger manifest read like a cross-section of international travel in the early 80s. There were families returning home to Korea, business travelers, tourists, and among them United States Congressman Larry McDonald from Georgia, who was traveling to Seoul to attend commemorations of the 30th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. The passengers settled into their seats, unaware that they would soon be at the center of an international crisis. The flight from New York to Anchorage proceeded without incident. After refueling in Alaska, Flight 007 took off again at 12:52 a.m. local time on September 1st. The flight plan called for the aircraft to follow Romeo 20, one of 5 designated North Pacific air routes that connected Alaska to Asia. These routes had been carefully plotted to keep civilian aircraft away from Soviet airspace, threading them through international waters, while avoiding the sensitive military installations of the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. But something went wrong almost immediately after departure. Instead of following Romeo 20, which would have taken the aircraft safely along the Aleutian Islands and then southwestward toward Japan, Flight 007 began drifting off course. Within minutes of leaving Anchorage, the Boeing 747 was deviating from its assigned route, veering westward. The deviation was small at first, barely noticeable, but with every passing minute, the aircraft strayed further from where it was supposed to be. How did an experienced crew, flying a modern aircraft equipped with sophisticated navigation systems, end up so far off course? This question would become the subject of intense investigation and endless speculation. The aircraft had 3 independent navigation systems, dual inertial navigation systems, and a magnetic compass. The inertial navigation systems were technological marvels of their time, using gyroscopes and accelerometers to calculate position based on the aircraft's movement. Pilots would input waypoints, the designated points along the route, and the autopilot would fly the aircraft from point to point. The most likely explanation, according to investigators, was human error during the setup of the navigation systems. If the crew had failed to switch the autopilot from heading mode to inertial navigation mode, the aircraft would have simply flown on a constant magnetic heading rather than following the programmed route. Another possibility was that waypoints were incorrectly entered into the system. Whatever the cause, the crew apparently did not notice the deviation. Position reports radioed to air traffic control matched their flight plan, but these may have been based on where they thought they were, not where they actually were. As Flight 007 crossed the North Pacific, it was entering some of the most sensitive airspace in the world. The Soviet Union maintained extensive military facilities on the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, including nuclear submarine bases, radar installations, and air defense networks. The Soviets were obsessively protective of this region, and any unauthorized aircraft entering their airspace was considered a potential threat, possibly an American spy plane gathering intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. The United States did indeed conduct reconnaissance flights along the Soviet border, using modified Boeing 707's aircraft designated as RC-135s. These missions were routine during the Cold War, probing Soviet air defenses and collecting electronic intelligence. The Soviets knew these flights occurred and scrambled fighters to intercept them regularly. From a Soviet radar operator's perspective, the distinction between an RC-135 spy plane and a Boeing 747 passenger jet might not be immediately obvious. Both were large, four-engine Boeing aircraft with similar radar signatures. On this particular night, an actual RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft had been operating in the area earlier, though it had completed its mission and left before Flight 007 entered Soviet airspace. This coincidence would later fuel Soviet claims that the airliner was engaged in espionage, deliberately gathering intelligence under the cover of a civilian flight. At approximately 3 a.m, Flight 007 crossed into prohibited Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. Soviet ground-based radar detected the intruder, and 6 fighters were scrambled to intercept. In the darkness, the Soviet pilots failed to make visual contact before the aircraft exited their airspace and continued westward over the Sea of Okhotsk. The Boeing 747 flew on, its passengers sleeping or watching movies, completely unaware that they had just penetrated Soviet territory, or that fighter jets had been hunting them in the darkness below. The crew continued making routine position reports, still apparently unaware of their true location. 2.5 hours later, at approximately 5 a.m, Flight 007 made its fatal error. Instead of being safely over international waters east of Japan, the aircraft crossed into Soviet airspace again, this time over Sakhalin Island. Soviet air defense forces, already on high alert from the earlier incursion over Kamchatka, responded swiftly. Multiple fighters were scrambled, including Su-15 interceptors, one of which was piloted by Major Gennady Osipovich. What happened in the next minutes would be pieced together from Soviet military communications, which were intercepted and recorded by Japanese and American listening posts. Major Osipovich located the target on his radar and closed in for visual identification. He would later report that he made several attempts to identify the aircraft, firing warning shots with his cannon and attempting to signal the intruder with his lights. However, these claims remain disputed. The cannon fire, if it occurred, may have been too far away for the passenger jet to notice, and the international signal for an aircraft to follow an interceptor involves rocking wings and using navigation lights, procedures that may not have been properly executed. Inside Flight 007, the crew gave no indication they knew they were being intercepted. They made no emergency calls, no distress signals. Either they never saw the fighter, or they didn't recognize the danger they were in. The Boeing 747 continued on its course, and to the Soviet pilot and his ground controllers, this suggested a deliberate intrusion, possibly a reconnaissance aircraft deliberately ignoring intercept procedures. At 5:26 a.m. local time, with Flight 007 about to exit Soviet airspace and escape over international waters, Major Osipovich received permission to engage. He fired 2 air-to-air missiles. The first, a heat-seeking missile, struck the Boeing 747's tail section. The second may have missed or malfunctioned. The initial explosion was catastrophic, but not immediately fatal to the aircraft. In the cockpit, alarms began screaming. The aircraft had suffered massive damage to its hydraulic systems and was depressurizing rapidly. Captain Chun radioed air traffic control in Tokyo with a terse message indicating they had rapid decompression and were descending. It was the last communication from Flight 007. The crippled Boeing 747 began a spiraling descent. With hydraulic systems failing, the pilots would have had minimal control. The aircraft fell from its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, spinning and tumbling through the darkness. Passengers, if conscious, would have experienced the terror of weightlessness, alternating with crushing G-forces as the aircraft spiraled downward. The oxygen masks would have dropped, but at the rate of descent, they would have provided little help. 12 minutes after being hit, Flight 007 plunged into the Sea of Japan west of Sakhalin Island. The impact with the water at such high speed would have been instantly fatal for anyone still alive. All 269 people aboard were killed. As dawn broke over the Sea of Japan, the world remained unaware of the tragedy. It would be hours before the South Korean government announced that Flight 007 was missing. Initial reports were confused. Had the aircraft crashed, been forced to land? The Soviet Union remained silent. When the truth began to emerge, the international reaction was one of shock and outrage. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, condemned the shootdown as a barbaric act. Reagan called it an act of savagery and a massacre, using the incident to reinforce his characterization of the Soviet Union as an evil empire. The United Nations Security Council convened emergency sessions. Countries around the world banned Aeroflot flights and suspended other forms of cooperation with the Soviet Union. The Soviets initially denied shooting down the aircraft, then claimed it was a deliberate spy mission by the United States, using the passenger jet as cover. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, held a press conference displaying charts and claiming the aircraft had been on a reconnaissance mission. The Soviets argued that the crew had ignored warnings and that their actions were justified to protect Soviet airspace. The propaganda value of the incident for both sides was immense. The United States portrayed it as evidence of Soviet disregard for human life and international law. The Soviets, paranoid and defensive, saw it as an American provocation. The truth, that this was a tragic accident caused by a navigation error and compounded by Cold War tensions and inadequate communication, satisfied no one's narrative. Recovery efforts began immediately. Soviet, American, Japanese, and South Korean ships converged on the area. The Soviets, who controlled the waters where the aircraft went down, conducted an extensive secret search, recovering the aircraft's flight recorders and other debris. They would not reveal these findings for years. Meanwhile, international search efforts recovered some wreckage and human remains, but the Soviets prevented a thorough investigation. The families of the victims were left with grief and questions that would never be fully answered. For many, the lack of bodies, the incomplete investigation, and the propaganda war that followed added to their anguish. Larry McDonald's death made him a martyr to anti-communist conservatives in America. The other passengers, including children and families, became symbols in a larger geopolitical struggle, their individual stories lost in the macro narrative. The International Civil Aviation Organization conducted an investigation hampered by Soviet refusal to cooperate fully. The final report concluded that Flight 007 had deviated from its planned course due to crew error, most likely a failure to properly engage the inertial navigation system. The report also criticized the Soviet Union for shooting down a civilian aircraft without proper identification and for failing to provide assistance after the shootdown. The tragedy prompted significant changes in aviation and military procedures. The International Civil Aviation Organization strengthened rules about civilian aircraft straying into hostile airspace. Airlines improved training on navigation systems and cross-checking procedures. Most significantly, President Reagan announced that the Global Positioning System, then a classified military technology, would be made available for civilian use once it became operational. This decision would eventually revolutionize navigation for aircraft, ships, and eventually everyday users around the world. On the Soviet side, the incident revealed serious problems with their air defense procedures. The failure to properly identify the aircraft before shooting it down, the communication failures between ground controllers and pilots, and the international backlash all prompted internal reviews. However, the political climate in the Soviet Union, with Cold War paranoia at its peak and leadership in transition, prevented honest examination of what had gone wrong. One of the most disturbing aspects of the incident was how close it brought the world to wider conflict. When the shootdown occurred, Soviet-American relations were already at a dangerous low point. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, martial law had been imposed in Poland, and rhetoric on both sides was becoming increasingly belligerent. The KAL-007 incident occurred just weeks before a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83, which Soviet intelligence feared might be cover for an actual nuclear-first strike. The combination of heightened tensions, miscommunication, and military forces on high alert created conditions where a miscalculation could have triggered catastrophe. In the years following the shootdown, more information gradually emerged. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some classified documents became available. In 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin released the black boxes to the International Civil Aviation Organization. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, which the Soviets had recovered soon after the incident but kept hidden for 9 years, confirmed that the crew had no idea they had strayed off course until the moment they were hit. The recordings contained no evidence of spy activity, just routine cockpit conversation, followed by sudden alarms and desperate attempts to control the damaged aircraft. Major Osipovich, the pilot who fired the missiles, gave interviews in later years. He maintained that he had followed orders and procedures as he understood them. He expressed no remorse, viewing himself as a soldier who had done his duty. Other Soviet personnel involved in the incident told similar stories of following protocols, protecting their homeland from what they believed was an intruder with hostile intent. Conspiracy theories inevitably arose and persist to this day. Some claim the flight was deliberately routed over Soviet territory as a spy mission. Others suggest it was shot down by the United States to create an international incident. Some families of victims, unable to accept the official explanation, have proposed various alternative scenarios. However, the weight of evidence supports the conclusion that this was a terrible accident, a navigation error compounded by Cold War tensions and protocols designed for military threats rather than lost civilian aircraft. The story of Korean Airlines Flight 007 serves as a reminder of how human error, technological failure, and political context can combine with lethal effect. A simple mistake in setting up navigation equipment led an aircraft hundreds of miles off course. Cold War paranoia transformed that mistake into a military threat. Inadequate procedures for identifying and intercepting an unknown aircraft resulted in the deaths of 269 innocent people. It reminds us that in times of international tension, the margin for error shrinks dangerously. Systems designed to protect nations can become mechanisms of tragedy when applied without sufficient safeguards, communication, or humanity. The Soviet air defense forces that night were primed to see threats, not civilians. The protocols they followed, while perhaps logical in a military context, made no accommodation for the possibility of a lost passenger jet. For aviation, the legacy of KAL-007 is improved safety. The introduction of GPS has made navigation errors of such magnitude virtually impossible. Modern aircraft have multiple redundant systems that alert crews immediately if the aircraft deviates from its flight plan. International protocols for intercepting and identifying aircraft have been refined and clarified. Airlines have improved crew training and cockpit procedures. Yet the human cost can never be balanced against these improvements. 269 people died that night. Families were shattered, and the world witnessed how Cold War tensions could turn a navigation error into a massacre. The tragedy stands as a monument to the dangers of militarization, poor communication, and the dehumanization that occurs when civilians become collateral damage in geopolitical struggles. As we look back on the KAL-007 shootdown more than 4 decades later, it belongs to a specific moment in history when the Cold War was at its most dangerous, when the world seemed perpetually on the brink of nuclear confrontation, and when mistakes could have world-ending consequences. The passengers and crew of Flight 007 were victims not just of a navigation error or an overzealous air defense system, but of an entire international system built on mutual suspicion and the willingness to see threats everywhere. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as propaganda for either side of a long-ended conflict, but as a human tragedy that should never have happened and must never be allowed to happen again.